Something just cracked inside Europe. Not on a battlefield, not in a missile strike or a drone swarm over Kyiv. It happened at a ballot box in a country most people forget to mention when they talk about this war. And the consequences are going to be felt all the way to Moscow. Hungary just voted Viktor Orbán out of power. And with that single democratic decision, Vladimir Putin lost something he cannot replace. This wasn't a close race. This wasn't a squeaker that political analysts will debate for months. Péter Magyar and his Tisza party absolutely dismantled Orbán's grip on the country, pulling in 53% of the national vote and converting that into a supermajority inside Hungary's National Assembly, 141 seats out of 199. Orbán's party, Fidesz, the machine that held Hungary under a suffocating political grip for 16 years, is now a shell, a rump opposition with no real power to block what comes next. And what comes next is going to shake the entire geopolitical landscape of Europe. Magyar is already moving at a speed that suggests he's been waiting a long time for this moment. Within days of the result being confirmed, he secured a pledge from Hungary's president, Tamás Szúlyog, to accelerate the formation of the new parliament, pushing the date forward to May 4th. Orbán has less than 2 weeks left in power, a man who once seemed completely untouchable, a leader who engineered his own political survival so carefully that analysts openly questioned whether Hungary could ever be democratically corrected, that man is now counting down the hours, refusing to even attend his final European Council meeting on April 24th. He isn't going out with dignity. He's disappearing quietly, tail firmly between his legs. Magyar isn't wasting a single second of the transition period. The state television and radio networks that spent years blacking out his campaign, erasing his name from headlines and pretending his rallies didn't exist at Orbán's direct instruction, those same networks are now broadcasting Magyar's announcements about how he plans to install independent, impartial editors at the very outlets that Orbán weaponized to glorify himself. He's proposing a 2-term limit for future Hungarian prime ministers, which would permanently bar Orbán from attempting a comeback. He's publicly warned Fidesz officials not to play innocent, telling them directly, "We know what you've done to our beloved homeland and the Hungarian people. And don't doubt for a single moment that you will reap what you sow." Magyar has even refused to move into the castle office that Orbán relocated to Buda Castle back in 2018, a symbolic power grab that Magyar wants no part of. Hungary's new prime minister is setting up shop near parliament, near the people, not above them. But here's the part that matters most to this war and to Putin. For years, and we mean years, Orbán served as something genuinely unique inside the European Union. Every bloc has its friction points. Every coalition has members who drag their feet. But Orbán wasn't dragging his feet. He was actively working against Europe's ability to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. He was doing it deliberately, consistently, and at enormous cost to the Ukrainian people. And the reason was simple. He had become Putin's most valuable political asset on the entire continent. To understand how valuable that asset was, you have to understand what the European Union actually is, a consensus machine. A slow, bureaucratic organism that requires agreement from its members to do almost anything significant. Sanctions, packages, financial aid mechanisms, policy decisions on military support, all of it requires alignment. And for 3 years, every single time Europe tried to align itself firmly against Russia, Orbán was there to throw a wrench into the gears. He used procedural delays. He used veto threats. He used diplomatic leverage to slow down decisions that, without his interference, would have passed far more quickly and helped Ukraine far more directly. Putin knew exactly what he had in Orbán. He cultivated that relationship carefully, over a very long time. The irony is almost too much to take. Orbán didn't start out as a friend of Russia. He started out as the opposite. He was the young, fiery, liberal politician who stood in a Budapest square in 1989 and demanded that Soviet troops leave Hungary. He was the man chosen to deliver a speech at the reburial of Imre Nagy, the Hungarian prime minister who led the 1956 revolution against Soviet occupation and was executed for it. That was who Orbán once was. What he became is something much harder to look at. His transformation didn't happen overnight. It was gradual, cynical, and carefully constructed around a political strategy that prioritized his own survival above everything else. By the time he clawed his way back to power in 2010, after a first term that had pushed Hungary toward deeper EU and NATO integration, Orbán had a completely different message. Fear the migrants flooding across Europe's borders. Distrust foreign funding. Fight the intelligentsia. Close Hungary off from the outside world and the dangerous ideas it carried. It was a playbook ripped almost directly from what Putin had been running in Russia for a decade, and Orbán followed it so faithfully that the two men eventually became deeply, strategically linked. That linkage wasn't just ideological. It was financial. It was energetic. It was, as it turns out, deeply covert. Hungary signed a 5-year supply deal with Gazprom, locking itself into Russian natural gas long after most of Europe had begun the painful process of weaning itself off Russian energy. When EU leaders pushed for tougher energy restrictions to starve Putin's war chest, Orbán's foreign minister, Péter Magyar, stood up and declared that Hungary simply had no alternative, that EU leaders calling for energy independence had become fanatics, and that his country couldn't be expected to fund its own energy needs any other way. It was an argument that served Russia's interests almost perfectly, because every euro flowing into Russian energy accounts was a euro helping fund the missiles landing on Ukrainian cities. But even that wasn't the worst of it. The energy dependence was visible, debatable, and at least, theoretically, explainable in economic terms. What Reuters revealed in early April of this year was something far more difficult to explain away. Magyar, the same foreign minister who kept defending Russian gas imports, had been offering to share internal European Union documents with Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, about Ukraine's path toward EU membership. Internal documents. Confidential material about one of the EU's most sensitive ongoing processes handed to the man who serves as the diplomatic face of the country trying to destroy Ukraine. Additional leaked recordings indicated that Magyar had also been working with Russian officials to identify ways to soften the sanctions that the EU was placing on Russian individuals. This wasn't bureaucratic obstruction. This wasn't diplomatic friction. This was active collusion with a hostile power, conducted in secret, while sitting at the table of an alliance, supposedly united against that very power. Putin didn't just have a loud voice in the EU. He had an informant. And that informant's boss just lost an election by 53% to 47%. In the immediate hours after Magyar's victory became undeniable, the Kremlin's response was something worth studying closely, because it told you everything about how panicked Moscow actually was. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's longtime spokesman, initially declared that Hungary had placed itself on Russia's list of unfriendly countries, the same list that most of Europe already sits on. He claimed that Hungary no longer had any special status with Russia. And then, in a statement so transparently desperate it almost felt like self-parody, Peskov added that Russia had never actually been friends with Orbán in the first place. Let that settle in for a moment. Viktor Orbán, the man who likened his support for Putin to a mouse helping a lion, drawing from a Hungarian folktale to describe how devoted he was to Russia's cause, was now being publicly disowned by the Kremlin within hours of losing power. The man who blocked billions in EU aid for Ukraine, who signed 5-year gas deals with Gazprom, who shared classified EU documents with Lavrov, who consistently ran diplomatic interference for Russia inside European institutions, Russia's official position is now that they were never friends with this man. Not friends. Never. Really. Allies. Nothing to see here. It's the kind of statement you make when you're scared, when you're trying to leave every door open because the political ground just shifted under your feet and you're desperate to find new footing. Peskov had gone from throwing Orbán under the bus to dangling the possibility of pragmatic dialogue with Magyar in the space of a single press cycle. The Kremlin's message was incoherent because the Kremlin was caught off guard. And that matters, because Putin's entire operation in Europe depends on projecting strength and certainty. The scrambled response revealed neither. Now here's where the consequences for Ukraine get very specific and very significant. In the months before the election, as Orbán's grip on Hungary was already starting to look shakier than it once had, The European Union had approved a loan of €90 billion, roughly $105 billion, structured around the frozen assets of the Russian state. It was an enormous financial commitment designed to give Ukraine the resources it desperately needed to sustain its defense. The mechanism was complex, the legal framework was debated intensely, and the approval process was long. But it got done. Almost every EU member state signed on, except Hungary. Orbán refused. He claimed he would only lift his objection once Ukraine agreed to restore the flow of Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline, a pipeline that had been damaged and whose continued operation would directly benefit Russia's energy revenues. In other words, he was demanding that Ukraine help fund the country, trying to conquer it as the price of releasing financial aid that had already been approved by the rest of Europe. The money sat frozen for months, while Ukraine continued to absorb missile strikes and drone attacks, running short on the interceptors it needed to protect its cities. That blockage is now gone. Orbán is gone, and the first tranche of that €90 billion loan could be flowing into Ukraine as early as May. EU ambassadors were already meeting in Brussels on April 22nd to map out the next steps. The funds Ukraine is looking at spending first include Patriot interceptor missiles, the systems that Ukraine uses to shoot down Russia's ballistic missiles before they reach population centers and Storm Shadow cruise. Missiles, which give Ukraine a long-range strike capability it can use against Russian positions in occupied territories, near the border, and in the Black Sea. These are not small additions. These are weapons that materially change what Ukraine can do on the battlefield and how well it can protect its people. Beyond that specific loan, the broader flow of EU support for Ukraine just got significantly smoother. Every sanction package that required negotiating around Orbán's objections becomes easier to pass. Every policy decision related to Ukraine's future relationship with the EU and with NATO no longer has to survive a veto threat from Budapest. The information-sharing pipeline that ran from Hungary's foreign ministry to Moscow is being dismantled along with the rest of Orbán's apparatus. Ukraine no longer has to worry that the details of its EU accession negotiations are making their way to the Russian government before the ink is dry. That's a fundamental change in the operating environment for both Ukraine and the EU. To be fair and precise about what comes next, Hungary under Magyar is not about to become Ukraine's new best friend. Magyar has been clear that he won't send Hungarian weapons or military aid to Ukraine directly. He doesn't appear to support fast-tracking Ukraine's EU membership, though he doesn't oppose it either. He's on record saying that no country should be forced to give up its territory, which is significant given the pressure Ukraine is currently under to cede land as part of any ceasefire arrangement. But that's a political statement, not a military commitment. Hungary, under Magyar, is going to pursue its own interests. Some of those will align more closely with Ukraine's than they did under Orbán. Many will simply be neutral. Hungary will likely maintain some relationship with Russia, particularly around energy, because the infrastructure and contracts Orbán locked in don't vanish overnight. What changes is that Hungary is no longer a weapon in Putin's hand. A small country becomes much less dangerous when it stops being operated by someone working against you. But maybe the most important consequence of what just happened in Hungary isn't measured in euros or missile systems or voting blocks. Maybe it's measured in something harder to quantify, but far more powerful in the long run. Putin built his influence in Europe on a story. The story was that liberal democracy was exhausted, that the West was fracturing from within, that countries like Hungary were proving it was possible to resist the globalist consensus and survive, even thrive under a different model. That story served two audiences. It served the Russian public, who were told that Europe was not as united or as appealing as it was being made out to be. And it served potential allies and sympathizers elsewhere in Europe, who could look at Orbán and see a man who had made his arrangement with Russia work, who had kept power, who had beaten back every attempt to remove him. Orbán was Putin's evidence that the model worked. The poster child for the idea that authoritarian adjacent governance, combined with a cozy relationship with Moscow, was a viable long-term strategy inside the EU itself. Magyar's victory shreds that evidence, completely, decisively, with 53% of the vote. Even with Orbán's control of the media, even with his manipulation of electoral boundaries, even with Russian disinformation campaigns running in the final weeks before the vote, spreading false stories about Magyar secretly funneling aid to Ukraine, fabricating claims about embezzlement, inventing rumors that he planned to reinstate military conscription, even with all of that working against him, Magyar won. Convincingly. The fear politics that Orbán had used for 16 years stopped working. The propaganda stopped landing. And the people of Hungary walked into those polling stations and voted for something different. That signal is heard far beyond Budapest. Other nations in Europe, nations where Russia has spent years running similar influence campaigns, cultivating similar sympathizers, building similar systems of informational control and political dependency, are watching what just happened in Hungary. And what they're seeing is that democratic correction is possible even in the places Putin thought he had locked down. Even when a leader has spent years dismantling the structures designed to remove him. Even when Russian money and Russian disinformation are both deployed to keep things the way they are, even then, the vote can flip it. That is terrifying to Putin. More terrifying, arguably, than any weapon system Ukraine could acquire, because weapons can be countered with other weapons. But the idea that his network of influence inside Europe is penetrable, that the populations he's been trying to manipulate have the capacity to see through it and choose differently, that's a crack in the foundation of his entire European strategy. It's the kind of crack that spreads. Hungary proved something to the rest of the continent, and the rest of the continent noticed. For Ukraine, the road ahead is still brutally difficult. The war is not won. Russian forces are still on Ukrainian soil. The pressure to negotiate on unfavorable terms hasn't gone away. But the environment in which Ukraine is fighting that war just shifted meaningfully. The financial pipeline from the EU just cleared. The intelligence leak from Budapest to Moscow just closed. The veto that kept blocking Europe's ability to act as a unified force just disappeared. And the dominant narrative that Putin had been using to sell his war to his own people, the narrative that Europe was divided, exhausted, and ready to abandon Ukraine, just took a body blow it may not recover from. Viktor Orbán walked into the sunset of his political career as a man who had sold his country's sovereignty to a foreign power, who had lied to his people about who he was working for, and who had actively worked to prolong a war that has killed tens of thousands of people. History is not going to be kind to him. And Putin, sitting somewhere behind the walls of one of his many secured residences, processing what just happened in a country with a population smaller than Moscow, is realizing something deeply uncomfortable. The mouse he thought was helping him was actually the only thing holding a very large dam in place. That dam just broke.